Picture this, a 6-year-old girl draped in golden silk that pools around her feet, walking slowly down the cold stone aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral. Hundreds of candles flicker against stained glass windows as solemn choirs echo through the nave. All eyes are on her, tiny, fragile, barely able to carry the weight of her crown. At the end of that aisle waits her groom, Richard II, King of England. He's 29. This isn't a fairy tale. It's not a myth. It's history. The girl is Isabella of Valois, youngest daughter of the French crown. And today she's being given away, offered like a diplomatic gift on the altar of medieval power. A child queen traded to secure a truce between two kingdoms locked in a century of war. Isabella didn't choose this. She didn't even understand it. Raised in a palace ruled by her father's madness and her mother's ambition, she grew up surrounded by betrayal, not bedtime stories. Her wedding, orchestrated like a state ceremony, wasn't about love. It was about leverage. And yet this haunting procession at St. Paul's is only the beginning of her story. Over the next 13 years, Isabella would be widowed before her 10th birthday, held captive in a foreign court, used again in another political marriage, and finally dead at just 19, her life consumed by forces she could never control. How does a child become a queen? More importantly, why? Isabella of Valois forces us to confront a chilling truth about the medieval world, that behind the thrones, behind the treaties, were girls like her, silenced, manipulated, and sacrificed. She wore a crown, yes, but did she ever truly have a childhood? Was Isabella a queen or a prisoner in gold? Isabella of Valois entered the world on November 9, 1389, not into lullabies or gentle lullings of royal comfort, but into a palace haunted by delusion. Her birthplace, the Louvre Palace in Paris, was no sanctuary. It was a stage where power and paranoia performed side by side. Her father, King Charles VI of France, had once been called Charles the Beloved. But by the time Isabella was born, he was known by another name, Charles the Mad. At just 24, the king had succumbed to violent bouts of insanity. He would run screaming through palace corridors, lash out at his own men, or retreat into rooms claiming he was made of glass and would shatter if touched. On his darkest days, he forgot who his wife and children were. On others, he believed he wasn't king at all. The court feared him, his servants tiptoed, his physicians whispered, his kingdom teetered. In this fragile world, Isabella grew, watched, not nurtured. Her mother, Isabeau of Bavaria, was a woman both revered and reviled. Regal and ruthless, she was determined to preserve the monarchy at any cost, even if it meant selling pieces of her own family to do it. Chroniclers called her manipulative, calculating. She was accused of adultery, of extravagance, of turning her back on her children while embracing lovers and power brokers. To Isabeau, her daughters weren't daughters. They were currency. And Isabella, with her quiet gaze and porcelain beauty, would soon become the most valuable coin of all. In the medieval world, madness didn't disqualify a king. It empowered his enemies and empowered his queen. And while the king raved, the queen plotted. Behind her jeweled veil, Isabeau began laying the groundwork to use Isabella as her ultimate offering in a grand political bargain. By the time Isabella turned 6, she had witnessed screaming fits, whispered betrayals, and doors that never closed without locking behind them. She had never known peace, only the cold calculation of proximity to the throne. So when a request came from England, a grieving king in need of a bride to seal a fragile truce, Isabeau did not hesitate. She didn't ask if her daughter was old enough. She didn't ask if her daughter was ready. She only asked, how much is she worth? And with that, the wheels turned. Ivory scrolls were inked, ambassadors dispatched, dowries measured, and Isabella of Valois, barely out of infancy, was promised to a man she had never met, in a kingdom she had never seen. The question wasn't if she would be taken, it was when. In the autumn of 1396, Paris buzzed with a strange, muted anticipation. Across the Channel, England had extended its hand, not for war, for once, but for a wedding. Richard II, King of England, widowed and weakened by internal dissent, had sent envoys to the French court. What he wanted wasn't love, it was leverage. And the offer on France's side? A child, Isabella. She was just 6 years old, barely able to hold a quill, much less sign a treaty. But in the eyes of kings and counselors, her youth was irrelevant. What mattered was her bloodline and what peace she could purchase. For a kingdom bled dry by the 100 Years' War, Isabella became the living price tag on a 28-year truce. The dowry alone, £800,000, was one of the richest ever promised in medieval Europe. Negotiations dragged for months, cold and clinical. English diplomats debated her age as if she were livestock. Would 12 not be better? One advisor asked. She cannot yet bear heirs. But Richard II was desperate. Rebellions festered in his court. The nobility itched for blood. He needed peace, and he needed it now. Whether the bride could speak or not, whether she cried or smiled was irrelevant. In October, the deal was sealed. The farewell at the Louvre was a spectacle of chilling contrast. King Charles VI, in a rare moment of lucidity, wept as he kissed his daughter goodbye. Isabeau of Bavaria, ever the tactician, stood emotionless, her eyes on the English gold, not the child. Isabella was handed over like a treasure chest, dressed in white, silent, surrounded by guards and officials. Her only comfort, a few dolls and her beloved lapdog tucked into her carriage. The journey to England took weeks, marked by parades, pageants, and forced smiles. At each city, crowds cheered. Nobles bowed, but Isabella, tired, overwhelmed, lost in silks too heavy for her shoulders, simply asked when she would see her family again. St. Paul's Cathedral glowed with thousands of candles, French and English tapestries intertwined above the nave. The organ thundered like divine approval. Richard II waited at the altar, regal yet distant. When Isabella entered, she could barely walk under the weight of her garments. The Archbishop of Canterbury knelt to place the ring on her tiny hand. Her eyes scanned the crowd for a familiar face and found none. And yet Richard did not touch her, did not share her bed. By most accounts, he treated her more like a daughter than a queen, an act of mercy that history has not forgotten. But mercy has limits. Though Richard spared her innocence, he had still condemned her future. Because when kings fall, their queens, no matter how young, fall harder. And Richard's grip on the crown was already slipping. As Isabella stood crowned but confused, the next act of her life was already writing itself. One where she would not be honored as a wife, but branded as a political liability. And this time there would be no gentle groom to protect her. The crown didn't slip, it shattered. In 1399, just 3 years after marrying a 6-year-old bride to buy peace, Richard II was deposed by his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke. Once in exile, Henry returned with an army, a grudge, and a hunger for the throne. Richard, isolated and politically exhausted, offered no resistance. He was imprisoned, silenced, and soon murdered. Cold, quiet, and alone in Pontefract Castle. And just like that, Isabella became a widow. She was 10, but instead of being sent home to mourn, she was held in England, kept like a gilded relic of a regime now erased. Henry IV, newly crowned, understood the danger she posed. Isabella was still technically Queen of England. Her marriage hadn't been consummated, but it had been witnessed by thousands. She represented the last legitimacy of Richard's reign, and worse, her dowry was gone, spent. Returning her to France would mean returning the money, a fortune he could not repay. So he kept her, not in chains, but in comfort. She was moved to Havering Palace, a royal estate turned velvet prison. There were gardens, tutors, servants, but not freedom. Isabella began writing letters, not just to her mother, but to Charles VI, her father, when he could recognize her name. "I write to you in tears," she confessed, "for I am kept here like a prisoner, far from all I love, without hope of return." For all her silks and jewels, she was now no more than a bargaining chip waiting to be cashed in. The French court, outraged but cautious, hesitated. France and England were locked in a fragile truce. Demanding her return could tip the balance. So Isabella waited. Days turned to weeks, seasons passed, and the English, sensing opportunity, floated a dangerous idea: marry her off again, perhaps to one of Henry IV's sons, a new alliance. a new queen, crafted from the bones of the last regime. But France didn't forget her entirely. In 1401, under mounting diplomatic pressure, and in one of his rare moments of lucidity, Charles VI demanded her release. This time, Henry relented. But the Isabella who returned to France wasn't the child they had sent away. She was now 12, still a girl, but one who had already worn a crown, buried a king, and been held hostage for her nation's sins. Her silence now was not confusion, it was survival. When Isabella stepped off the ship in 1401, her feet touched French soil, but her spirit remained somewhere between the throne she'd lost and the cage she'd escaped. She was 12 now, older than her years, quiet but watchful. The same nobles who once celebrated her as a queen now received her like an inconvenient memory. The court no longer saw a child bride who had been sacrificed for peace. They saw a young woman of political value, again. Still, there was a pause, a silence in the rhythm of Isabella's life. For the first time in years, no one told her what to wear, where to stand, or who to smile at. And in that rare stillness, a name began to echo through the royal corridors. Charles, Duke of Orleans. He was a poet, a nobleman, a man of letters in an age of blood. Charles was 17, gentle-hearted, and uncommonly introspective. When they met, it wasn't at the altar. It was in conversation, in shared grief, in the quiet understanding of two souls born into duty. They fell in love. The marriage took place in 1406. There were ceremonies, yes, but more than that, there was ease. Isabella smiled. She laughed. For once, she wasn't just enduring history, she was writing it. Their union was more than political. It was personal. Together, they wrote poetry, hosted salons, planned for a family. For a moment, Isabella glimpsed something she'd never known. Freedom wrapped in affection, but love in Isabella's world was always borrowed. In 1415, as the 100 Years' War flared again, Charles went to battle at Agincourt, a campaign meant to defend France's honor. He never came back. Captured by the English, he would remain imprisoned for 25 years. And Isabella? Alone again. Not widowed this time, but practically erased. The courtiers stopped mentioning his name. The poets turned their songs elsewhere. And Isabella, once a queen, once a bride of hope, found herself back in the shadows, waiting. Only this time, there would be no triumphant return, no parade of treaties, only the long, slow silence of a heart broken twice by history. By 1409, Isabella's world had once again narrowed. Charles was still a prisoner across the Channel. The French court, engulfed in chaos, offered little comfort. She lived quietly, tucked behind palace walls, her name mentioned less with reverence and more with pity, and yet something inside her refused to wither. That year, she gave birth to her first and only child, a daughter, Joan. For a moment, it seemed as if the cycle might finally break, that Joan might grow up not as a bargaining chip, but as a child truly loved. Isabella, now 19, looked into her daughter's eyes and saw a future she herself had been denied. But history has never been kind to women like her. Shortly after childbirth, Isabella fell ill. The accounts are vague, some blame infection, others exhaustion, but the truth is brutally simple. Her body, pushed for years by power and politics, finally gave out. She died quietly. No court mourning, no national ceremony. The girl who had once been paraded through English cities, wrapped in gold, was now laid to rest with little more than a whisper. Isabella survived a mad father, a cold mother, a political marriage, royal imprisonment, and the grief of losing a husband not once, but twice. But in the end, it was childbirth, a fate common to women of every class, that stole her life. She was just 19. Her daughter would grow up never knowing her mother. Her husband would spend decades writing poetry from a prison cell, mourning a wife he barely had time to love. And the world, it moved on. Isabella of Valois became a footnote. But if we pause, truly pause, we see something more. A young woman whose life was dictated at every turn, who managed, despite it all, to carve out moments of dignity, of resistance, of love. A queen at 6, a widow at 10, a bride again at 16, a mother at 19, and then gone. The silence that followed her death wasn't just tragic, it was calculated. Because Isabella's story is an indictment, not of fate, but of a world that used girls to settle debts and called it diplomacy. Isabella of Valois was never meant to live for herself. From the moment she took her first steps inside the Louvre, her future had already been sold, traded between crowns, inked into treaties, and sewn into the hems of diplomatic gowns. Every chapter of her life was written by someone else's ambition. Married at 6 to end a war, widowed at 10 to seal a dynasty's fall, held hostage for peace, married again for unity, dead at 19 for giving life. Her story isn't just sad, it's revealing. It shows us the brutal cost of royal diplomacy, not in scrolls or seals, but in the bodies and souls of young girls. Isabella's short life is a haunting reminder that behind every treaty, every royal wedding, and every political maneuver of the medieval world, there was often a child, powerless, voiceless, and forgotten. And yet she endured. She survived the madness of her father, the cold calculations of her mother, the fall of a king, and the disappearance of a husband. She offered kindness where there was cruelty, loyalty where there was betrayal, dignity where there was control. Even in silence, she resisted. But history rarely rewards quiet resilience. When Isabella died, no bells rang, no monuments were built. The girl once crowned Queen of England was buried without fanfare, her memory eclipsed by louder, bloodier legacies. And yet, her legacy endures. She is a symbol, not of royalty, but of sacrifice, not of glory, but of survival. She reminds us that power often rests on the backs of those with no power at all. Isabella of Valois was not just a child queen, she was a casualty of empire. So we ask, how many more like her were buried in history's margins? How many girls were given away for peace, only to die without it? And how long until we remember their names?